Good evening and welcome to tonight's edition of Tisky Sour Quarantined. I'm Michael Walker and I'm speaking to you from my living room in East London. Tonight, I'm delighted to be joined by Aaron Bastani, co-founder of Novara Media, who's joining us from the south of England. How are you doing, Aaron?
I'm very well, Michael. Always better to see you.
Too kind. And I'm also joined by Ash Sarkar, contributing editor at Novara Media, speaking to me from North London. Am I right?
Northeast London.
How are you doing?
I'm good. All the better for seeing you. That was going to be my line until Aaron nicked it.
Or maybe we've known each other so long that I just kind of like I'm just imitating you because who wouldn't?
Who's copying who, perhaps? We'll never know.
Fighting my style.
Tonight we are going to talk about, well, obviously the latest developments with coronavirus in the country. Later on in the show, we're going to focus on the new trend in the media to try and downgrade deaths from coronavirus by suggesting they would have happened anyway. We're going to talk more about testing, which is the controversy which has dogged the government this week, something that's not going away and something on which they're still not being particularly clear. I don't think they're being quite open about what their strategy is at this point. We'll talk about that later. But first of all, I want to focus on the current death toll and how frustrated I am, and I think frustrated a lot of people are, that the government was warned that what we're seeing now was going to happen and they did nothing or very little. So COVID-19 took the lives of 684 people in the last 24 hours. This takes the UK death toll from the virus to 3,605, a 23% rise on the day before. Given there is an average 23-day delay between infection and death from COVID-19, the best estimate for anyone that died today is that they caught the virus on the 11th of March. That's 13 days before the UK went into lockdown. Among those who have died are two nurses, both in their 30s and both mothers of three. Our solidarity to their friends and family. It's a real tragic story. That the death toll is rising so quickly is shocking, but it's also wholly unsurprising. Anyone paying attention 3 weeks ago could see that without drastic and urgent action, Britain would be in the same state as Italy today, with hospitals nearing capacity, health workers falling sick, and COVID-19 running rampant among the old and the vulnerable. How we let this happen is the theme that's going to be running through tonight's show. First of all, I want to get both of your thoughts on that question. How did we come to this when, British policymakers could basically see into the future by looking at Italy, but for some reason thought that we were special?
Ash. Well, it's foreknowledge that the government has had for a lot longer than just 3 weeks. Back in 2016, those mavericks in Theresa May's government ran Exercise Cygnus, where over 3 days, the NHS participated in a wargaming of a pandemic influenza scenario. And what was found by Exercise Cygnus is that the UK would struggle when it came to personal protective equipment. It would struggle when it came to the availability of ventilators, and it would struggle when it came to the capacity of critical care beds. Now, rather than implementing the findings of that report, the Tory government of the day just went for ignore it and inshallah. And I suppose that's a reflection of the austerity-obsessed orthodoxy of the time. The certainty of saving money in the short term was considered to be more valuable than the possibility of saving lives in the long term by investing in the UK's pandemic preparedness. So we've known about this for a long time. I also got a message from a friend of mine just before we started the show today, who works for the civil service and has been working on COVID-19 stuff in the last few weeks. And what they messaged me was saying, pandemic influenza has been identified as the highest impact risk on the National Risk Register of Civil Emergencies put together by the Cabinet Office for Yonks. Most recent edition looks to be 2017, but I found a 2008 version with the same verdict too. So again, not necessarily this particular pandemic, but the likelihood of there being a pandemic that public institutions would have to deal with had been highlighted for quite some time. And I suppose whether or not you think the government is doing a good job when it comes to handling COVID-19 depends on whether or not you think it's an unreasonable expectation that the National Health Service should be equipped to deal with national public health emergencies. And then you've got this matter of what's been done in the last 3 weeks. And you're right, the government has been able to see since Wuhan went into lockdown, but even 3 weeks ago, when you look at the severity of what was happening in Italy in particular, where we were headed. And a few weeks ago, the Cheltenham Festival was still going ahead. Boris Johnson was boasting about going around a hospital and shaking hands with everyone, including COVID-19 patients. It wasn't that long that when Boris Johnson was asked about the role of the police in enforcing a lockdown, he seemed absolutely flabbergasted. This is a government who has been making it up as they go along and putting scientific advisors, whether it's the chief medical officer, Sir Patrick Vallance, or the deputy chief medical officer, Dr. Jenny Harries, the chief medical officer, of course, being Professor Chris Whitty, up as PR Kevlar, as a flak jacket, to basically put forward political decision-making, and it's political decision-making which is operating within the material constraints of our public services and their ability to deliver top quality care, and putting it in the mouths of scientists, so it appears apolitical. And it's a way of diffusing responsibility and saying, no, this is the scientific advice, this is the most scientifically robust thing to do, when it's not. Had we spent more money, had we invested in these systems earlier, had we taken action earlier, this wouldn't be the scientific advice. These are political decisions. It's the result of bad decision making by politicians.
I'm going to go to you in a moment, Aaron. First of all, I just wanted to, point out, Ash, you talked about how Cheltenham Festival was still going on when the government knew what was going on in Italy. I do really think it is worth sort of focusing on this idea that the 684 people who died today, the most likely date they were infected, given that the Lancet say there's a not incubation period, but there's a 5-day incubation period, but then an 18-day average period between symptoms and dying, which adds up to 23 days. So the people who died in the last 24 hours most likely caught the virus on the 11th of March. That famous Stereophonics gig in Cardiff, where you see all these people singing along together inside, it's a joyous moment at a music event. That was on the 14th of March. So these people were all most likely infected before that happened. I also want to say, you're watching Tysky Sour, you're watching Novara Media. We want to get more people watching this show. So in the YouTube description, there's a tweet. If you retweet that, that means that more people will come here. As ever, we love to see your comments. So comment on the hashtag Tysky Sour or under this video. We'll go to your questions at the end, but read out some of your comments as we continue the show. Aaron, your thoughts on the wasted 3 weeks that we have seen from the British government, whether it's a surprise, what you think explains it?
I think there's long and short-term factors. I think Ash has just touched on some of the longer-term factors. I think the short-term factors are Brexit has to be one of them. The first 2 cases we had of coronavirus in this country, I believe, were 2 Chinese nationals at York University, and they were found to have it on the 31st of January. We left the European Union on the 31st of January. Who remembers hearing a story on the 31st of January about the first 2 COVID-19 cases in the UK? I don't. And it was only several days earlier that Chris Whitty said we may at some point in the future have COVID-19 cases in Britain. We had them by the 31st of January. So we shouldn't over-exaggerate, actually, that period between us and Italy. We say, is it 2 weeks or is it 4 weeks? It was already here by the 31st of January. Bear in mind, Wuhan locks down on the 24th of January. So it was quite clear what kinds of steps needed to be taken. Now, I think departing the European Union was one thing. It meant we had a government which was asleep at the wheel. Boris Johnson was on his Christmas holiday until early January. I think coupled with that is a certain British exceptionalism. These things don't happen here. And that's a deeply ingrained cultural attitude, partly because we're an island. Things like, for instance, continental war. We haven't had a famine in mainland Britain. Ireland, a slightly different experience, obviously, in the last several hundred years. So I think there's this exceptionalism that infused a lot of thinking. We could never have the death toll of Italy. Why? Lombardy per head is as wealthy as we are. They've got more doctors per head than we do. They've got more ICU capacity than we do. What's your explanation? Why? Because we're Britain. I thought this is encapsulated by a tweet by Dan Hodges, where he said, are people seriously telling me that we should imitate the Italian health authorities? Who do you want? You don't want to imitate the Chinese. We shouldn't listen to the WHO. We shouldn't imitate the Italians. Who do you want to listen to? New York State? They're doing this even worse than we are.
It's as if he thinks the Italian healthcare system was run by Waluigi.
Well, what you did, and it seriously, 3 weeks feels like a really long time ago. And someone, replied to one of my tweets today with this point that I'd completely forgotten, which was that when people were first discussing the death toll in Italy, no radio host could talk about it without mentioning, oh, they're very tactile people, aren't they? The Italians. So it must be difficult for the Italians because they love hugging, kissing on the cheeks. And the idea was, the reason that the Italians are dying so often and in such high numbers from COVID-19. The reason it's hit Italy isn't because they were unlucky enough to be the first country to get a significant outbreak. And it does seem like luck that they were first. It's that they have, they're always kissing and they live with all their families. And, that won't happen in Britain because we all live separately. And we're too awkward to get that close to each other. So it's these stupid cultural explanations. I just want to get up. I mean, people will have seen these graphs endlessly over the last 3 weeks, but they are still very, very useful indicators of what's going on. This is tweeted by Ed Conway. So it's looking at the various trajectories of cumulative deaths in each, or not in each country, but in a few chosen countries. And you can see that the UK in the red is sort of actually on a steeper trajectory than Italy right now. It still has fewer deaths than Italy did at the point that, at this point, since the 100th death from coronavirus. So when you look at these graphs, they normally don't start on a particular date. They start at a particular phase in the development of the disease. And this graph has chosen the 100th death. I think the FT1 uses the 10th, but you can see our deaths are increasing actually at a faster rate than Italy, even though we don't always hug each other, which was sort of like a ridiculous argument that, people would be embarrassed to say it now, but literally there was no one on the radio who was talking about COVID-19 and the mass deaths it caused in Italy without mentioning it.
Well, look, if you look at, can I just say, if you look, another one was the Iranian government. The deputy Iranian health minister, I believe, had it, and he was sweating profusely, and he collapses in public, and a lot of people were saying, "Lol, imagine a member of government, a senior member of government, having COVID-19." That was less than a month ago.
As well. They're all joking, like, it's the health secretary. Yeah. Imagine the health secretary getting COVID.
And then we had our health minister, Nadine Dorries. Then we had the Secretary of State for Health, Matt Hancock. We had our Chief Medical Officer, Professor Chris Whitty. And we had Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, come down with COVID-19. And the minute you go, well, maybe this was indicative of their lackadaisical approach to social distancing, the fact that the government weren't taking it seriously and they were all wedged into this sweaty leather bench on, in the House of Commons. This might have something to do with the spread. They were like, how dare you be so uncaring? You've practically wished death on these people. No, of course I haven't wished death on these people. I don't want anyone to have COVID-19 and know that if one single person is infected, yes, even if they're a Tory, it endangers the rest of us. I want everyone to be well. I want everyone to be safe. I want everyone to be healthy. But the fact that they all have this disease and it's not being read into as a failure of their policy the same way it was in Iran, or a failure of, cultural practices the same way it was in Italy. Why is that? Why is that?
That's so true. It's not like when I'd completely forgotten about it. 3 weeks does feel like such a long time during this political moment. But when you're absolutely right, when the health minister of Iran came down with COVID-19, no one was saying this is evidence that COVID-19 can hit everyone, which is what they said about Matt Hancock. This is evidence that the Iranian government is completely incompetent and they're basically a joke.
We need regime change.
And when it happens, exactly. When will the Iranian government survive this? And then it happens here, and everyone's like, "Oh, it means we're all in it together." The British spirit means that our health secretary has got it. It's bananas. I want to go to a clip because something that has, I suppose, we'll all recognise that there does seem to have been a step change in coverage of the government this week. Scrutiny has become, not so much frowned upon. There was a quite incredible moment on Thursday when on the front page of the Daily Mail, the Telegraph and the Times, they all had huge critical headlines about the government not doing enough testing. I mean, one thing that frustrates me is that this was obvious ages ago and people have only woken up to it now, but it's better than nothing. But I want to go now to a clip of Julia Hartley-Brewer on her show this morning. She's asking a question to Matt Hancock about testing in care homes.
I, like an awful lot of people, have an elderly relative, an elderly aunt who's in a care home. Yesterday, we discovered that the care home has 11 suspected cases of COVID-19. Temperatures are taken 3 times a day. They have been given no antigen tests. They have been told there are no tests available for staff or for residents, and that there won't be any in the near future. We are talking about people in their 80s and 90s who are very likely to get very sick, very likely to die, and they're not being able to get tests.
So what frustrates me about that? One, I suppose, I mean, there's plenty of right-wing journalists who only notice there's a problem when something happens to their family. And you see it all the time.
Alison Pearson is my favourite one for that.
Alison Pearson, she does it with her kid, doesn't she? About GCSEs. I can't remember precisely what it was. But there's
unemployment benefit.
Yeah, you'll see it with that as well. But there's this point that they only notice when it happens personally to them. Otherwise, it's just people scaremongering and people having a go at the government. And the problem here is that what Julia Hartley-Brewer is talking about now was obvious 3 weeks ago. And we were talking about it 3 weeks ago. If you look at our show from 3 weeks ago, this is exactly what we were saying, which is that the government at that point had a cocooning strategy, which was to say, let's allow everyone in the country to get COVID-19, or the young fit people to get COVID-19, because that will build up a certain degree of immunity. But what we will do is we will keep the elderly and the vulnerable safe from it by cocooning them. Now, there was a big fat flaw in that plan, which anyone who was paying remote attention could see, which was that they hadn't done anything to cocoon the elderly. Like it worked in theory, but in practice they hadn't done anything, right? And what Julia Hartley-Brewer is talking about there is the fact that care homes, because you're not testing staff, and we're not testing staff because we don't have capacity, and because for quite a long period of time, until really quite recently, more recently than 3 weeks ago. So 3 weeks ago, there were still people visiting their elderly relatives in care homes. You know, people were going in and out of these places, and no wonder they've become, you know, a breeding ground for COVID-19, precisely in the place where everyone living there, by definition, is most vulnerable to it. And what she's noticed finally, because it's happened to one of her relatives, is that she's got a mum, I think it was, in a care home. And one, you know, they're becoming short-staffed because the staff aren't able to test themselves, so they're self-isolating just because one of their members of family has flu. Now you've got a load of agency staff coming in who are going from home to home to home, and they can't be tested either because the tests aren't there. So why the government would have had a strategy whereby you say, okay, let's just let everyone have it, and deal with the consequences later, before you'd worked out whether you had enough tests to protect the elderly, is just bananas. I kind of chose that one from Julia Hartley-Brewer because she was someone who's specifically one of the biggest cheerleaders for the government strategy. And not just that, she was incredibly dismissive of anyone who was questioning or criticizing what was obviously, at the time, an incredibly high-risk move from the government. I'm going to look at a couple of tweets. So this is back on the 22nd of March. Whatever Dom Cummings did or didn't say, the only thing that matters is this. Is Boris Johnson following the scientific and medical advice? The CMO and CSA, so Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientific Advisor, who stand alongside him, seem to think that he is. So she's a journalist, and what she said, the only thing that matters, there's only one thing that matters. If these two people are publicly saying it's the right strategy, then it's the right strategy. No need to ask any other questions. We showed you on the Wednesday show. So 2 days ago, I can't remember how many people died, but I think it was over 500. And I did that again, that maths where you say, what was the date 23 days ago? The date 23 days ago then was the 9th of March. On the 9th of March, the Chief Scientific Advisor had tweeted along the lines of, at some point in the future, we'll ask old people to self-isolate. So he was someone who, 500 people odd died, and they would have caught that when they were told by the Chief Scientific Advisor that they don't need to self-isolate yet. So this idea that you as a journalist just accept what they say because of their titles is fucking stupid. We'll just do a couple more. On the 16th of March, she retweets Dan Hodges saying the Chief Medical Officer, the Chief Scientific Advisor, or Caprice, it's your call. So one of those classic tweets of mocking anyone who's questioning the Chief Medical Officer. How dare you question these people when you don't have a fancy title like they do? I mean, I don't want to minimize it. They are scientists. That's cool. But many of the questions that were being asked of them by, for example, us, turned out to be precisely correct. So this idea that you just dismiss anyone else has turned out to be completely stupid. And then again on the 16th of March, this is after the press conference where Boris Johnson dumps the herd immunity strategy. quote tweeting Piers Morgan, Hartley Brewer writes, "It's not a U-turn." So she's still kind of really jumping on anyone who dares criticize the government strategy. We've talked on prior shows as to why it completely was a U-turn. They realized that their herd immunity strategy was actually going to kill upwards of 250,000 people, and decided maybe that wasn't going to be, politically acceptable for the public.
Yeah, not even boomer nihilism can accommodate that one. I mean, it's ridiculous, and I'm sure that Aaron in particular will have some particularly excoriating words for the state of the UK media. But I was looking at this behavior, and you know what? It wasn't just people on the right, like Dan Hodges or Julia Hartley Brewer, who considered their role to be holding the public to account for government decisions. It was also people on the so-called progressive centre, or even the so-called left, like Aisha Hazarika, mocking people for wanting more information or more insight into government decision-making as hipsters with humanities degrees. You're not an epidemiologist. You don't have the expertise. Why would you even want to get involved? Well, one, it is your job as a journalist to seek out pieces of information which the government would rather that the public didn't have, interpret it, evaluate it, and assess it, and then present it to the public. That is what your job is as a journalist. And it doesn't matter whether or not you are a medical specialist. You seek out that knowledge, you familiarize yourself with it, either by going to the subject material and learning something, God forbid, or interviewing someone who does know something about it. So it's not just that you're pumping out information blind to the public. Your role as a journalist is to interpret, evaluate, and analyze. What your job isn't as a journalist is to essentially be the dog sipping on a cup of coffee in a room that's on fire going, everything is fine, when clearly it's not. Your job as a journalist isn't to tell the public what pieces of information it shouldn't have. And I look at those tweets and yeah, it's stupid, and most of the country isn't on Twitter, and who even knows who half these people are, but it does seep out. It shapes the snatches of conversation you'll hear on LBC or the framing on BBC News, and that filters down into the minds of the public at large, and it lets people know how seriously they should be taking this and how much they should be changing their own behavior in light of what the threat is. So it has a serious impact on what people do. And when you're trying to manage a pandemic, public behavior is the be all and end all in terms of how successful you're going to be at containing it. And so if 3 weeks ago, the impression that you're giving to people is old people will be kind of fine. Doesn't matter that there are 6 million familial carers in this country who can't isolate themselves from their older relatives, because it will be a matter of life and death. It doesn't matter that the people who are professionally caring for older people in hospitals and in care homes can't have access to the tests either. It's all going to be broadly fine, and the rest of us can take it on the chin. It was completely reckless. It was completely irresponsible. And I can't help but feel that the blaseness with which this was all handled, and in particular, the erasure of the risk to younger people who have underlying health conditions, was based on an assumption that these people aren't quite as human as the rest of us, not quite as tough as the rest of us, and therefore, if they die, so be it. They were a drain on the public purse anyway. I can't help but feel that that was something that was informing that whole mindset.
I mean, that's a great segue into our next section. But yeah, Aaron, do you want to say something first?
Yeah, I think it says two things. So firstly, when we weren't in receipt of all the facts, it's important to bear in mind nobody knew. Epidemiologist, virologist, journalist, Aisha Hazarika, whatever she does, she pretends to be a comedian. I don't think she's even that. None of us knew that there was an issue of human-to-human transmission until January. Nobody on earth. So the idea that all of a sudden the chief medical officer's in receipt of all the facts 6 weeks later about a virus which wasn't even in much of mainland Europe by then. I mean, the point is nobody knew much at all. So given that, given the potential lethality, given the well-documented by then ease of transmission, given well-documented problems like the fact it could incubate and actually high numbers of people were asymptomatic, which again creates rapid diffusion of any virus, given all of that, it makes sense to be cautious. But Aisha Hazarika's priority was actually to bash left-wing people on Twitter, rather than actually say, this is a public health crisis, hundreds of thousands of people could die. Her priority was to bash people on the left on Twitter. I mean, it's just pathetic. Secondly, it speaks to their notion of politics. There has never been a famine in a democratic country. When I say democratic, I mean universal suffrage. Never. This is well covered by Amartya Sen and a Nobel Prize winning economist. Why has that happened? Because in a democracy, you have several things. Freedom of the press. Secondly, you can eject holders of public office. If they don't do a good job, you get rid of them. You know, we don't look at what countries have had famines and which ones haven't. Oh, yes, well, it correlates the public policymakers who are best informed about stopping a famine and, you know, agronomy. And no, it's about politicians who have to make certain choices because they know if they don't make good ones in the public interest, they're out. So Aisha Hazarika's kind of notion of the political, journalists shouldn't do anything, politicians shouldn't do anything, citizens shouldn't do anything. Let's all see what the chief medical officer is saying. That's not borne out in the data over the last 100 years. India, under the British Empire, had famine after famine after famine. There's not been a famine in India since 1948. That's not because you've got really smart civil servants and policymakers. It's because you've got a democracy and you've got a free press. And so under conditions of scarcity, there's a certain kind of response which actually puts people first. But again, I think that the explanation for that is her conception of politics as this technocratic managerialist, let the big boys with the PhDs do their things. Actually, it's about citizens being in receipt of all the facts, being well informed. And guess what? That takes journalists. You know, most journalists aren't going to know as much as a scientist on an issue of scientific importance, but they're journalists, so they can synthesize the information. Often they'll be better at making it readily digestible to a large audience. That's literally the job description of a journalist. But again, Aisha Hazarika works at the Evening Standard under George Osborne. She sees her job, I presume, more as being a press officer for the powerful.
That's such a good point. I mean, also, I like Ash bringing up that, you know, the cartoon meme that everyone's seen of the dog drinking tea. With the flames around him saying everything is fine. But it's more than that, because it's not just Aisha Hazarika and Julia Hartley-Brewer and Dan Hodges saying everything is fine. It's them sitting there drinking tea, shouting, "How dare you suggest everything might not be fine?" No, it's more active than that. It's an angry dog who's you know, barking at anyone who dares suggest that the building is on fire. You think the building's on fire? You're just saying that because you politically hate the building. You know, it's like, no, I can just see the building's on fire.
Yeah, you dumb Corbynista.
Exactly. You would say the building's on fire, wouldn't you?
And one of the things that astonishes me, and I had this recently from Dan Wootton on Talk Radio, who, you know, asked me to talk about Kevin Maguire's take that there should be a general election when all this is over. And I actually disagreed with Kevin Maguire. I don't think that it would be the right time for a general election. And I talked about, you know, other national crises and different ways of managing it and holding the powerful to account. And I talked about the need for a full inquiry, fully transparent public inquiry into how decisions were made. And he was like, how dare you? It's too soon to say that. And I was like, it's completely not. We are right now in the middle of a personal protective equipment crisis in the NHS. I have friends right now working in respiratory wards and A&E treating COVID-19 patients wearing surgical masks which are out of date until they literally have to intubate a patient, and that's when they can put a respirator on. You don't think there needs to be a public inquiry into that? We were promised thousands of ventilators by this weekend. We will only have 30 usable ventilators by this weekend. Yes, we've opened up the Nightingale Hospital in London with 4,000 extra beds. Do we have 4,000 extra ventilators? No, we don't. Shouldn't there be some sort of truth-telling and accountability about that when this is over? Dan Watson thought that was an absurdly partisan point. And I just thought the public didn't get the government that they deserved. But the level of idiocy in the media really got the government they deserved.
Yeah. I mean, I think inquiry is lightweight. I mean, an investigation, especially if herd immunity was the strategy, and it was led on by senior people in government, why wouldn't you have an inquiry? We knew after February 24th, the WHO and Chinese authorities said, get ventilators. They put it in big red lights, get ventilators, get PPE. And then March 15th, 3 weeks later, we've got Man Hancock tweeting.
Man's treating it like it's the Kiki challenge. He's doing shout outs for ventilators and personal protection
there is
equipment.
suggestion that there might be an inquiry afterwards, and we should be fighting for that. But also, I do think that this shouldn't just be a question for afterwards for two reasons. So one, if you scrutinize the government afterwards, then it's a bit too late. And I do think that one of the reasons why the government moved away from the herd immunity strategy was because they realized that the public had sort of seen that, oh, actually, we don't want 100,000 people to die. Because even on their initial modeling, if you read the Tim Shipman piece from a couple of weeks ago, they said what the change in modeling was that it wasn't going to be 100,000 people, but 250,000 people who died. So it seems like they were actually willing for 100,000 people to die.
Wasn't it more?
Until the public kind of clocked. I think it was that's what the Tim Shipman piece suggested anyway.
Chris Whitty, sorry, go on.
No, go on.
When Chris Whitty went on BBC Radio 4 and then Sky News, he explicitly said 60% of the population needs to get it, 60% of 65 million people for herd immunity. He explicitly said 1% of people would die. So it's 1% of 60% of 65 billion. I mean, I think it's a couple of 100,000. They were openly saying it. It wasn't just a Tim Shipman piece.
All right, we've got to move on to our next piece. First of all, you're watching Novara Media, watching Tiski Sauer. If you agree with what we've been saying, that during this crisis, especially the media or many parts of the media have not risen to the challenge of holding the government to account when it is more urgent than ever to do so, and because they're more interested in being press officers for the powerful than to actually trying to explain what's going on so that the general public are in a position to scrutinize the decisions being made to affect their lives. If you agree with all of that, then it might be worth donating to Novara Media, because that is what we aim to do. We are not interested in being press officers for the powerful. What we want to do is hold the powerful to account. I think that was, the original, or was supposed to be one of the original purposes of journalism. People seem to have forgotten that. So if you do want to make Novara Media possible, if you want us to grow, if you want us to be more professional than we already are, then please go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. Obviously, your wages are going to be a bit confusing at the moment. If you've just, if you're getting screwed over because you're in a 0 hours job, well, just give us a like on the video instead of giving us some cash, because we know that universal credit doesn't give you very much. But if you do have your standard income coming in this month and not much to spend it on because you're stuck in your house, then maybe throw us a COVID-19 bonus. I suppose a COVID-19 bonus isn't normally something people want, but there you go. The next topic we are going to talk about is a strategy which has emerged quite recently as sort of the death toll has been rising, to downplay what it means to have died from COVID-19. So we know, and this is true, that you are more vulnerable to COVID-19 if you are old or if you have an underlying condition. So, for example, diabetes or severe asthma. Or cancer, or numerous things, and that on a practical level is important to know, because we know who we need to cocoon, who we need to sort of take extra measures so that they don't catch the illness. But there are certain elements of the media who now think that this should be something we take on board as a moral question, to suggest that these people's lives aren't quite as valuable because they would have died anyway. This was sort of pushed quite explicitly by people like Andrew Neil and Toby Young last weekend. It was then taken on by Sky and most recently by the BBC. I'm going to run you through a clip and a tweet thread. So the first is from Sky News last weekend. They're talking about how we should interpret the death toll from COVID-19.
So let's take those 20,000 predicted deaths from coronavirus. Now, one of the government's key advisors hazarded a guess this week that between half and 2/3 of those dying would probably have done so soon anyway. So do the maths and deduct those from the predicted deaths, and you're left with somewhere between 6,667 and 10,000 deaths that can be attributed directly to the virus.
Deduct those from the total deaths, I think, is quite a sinister phrase. I want to go now to a BBC thread from yesterday. They are, of course, the organization where most people get their news. They lead on how we should talk about national crises. So we'll get up this thread now. News of more and more deaths is worrying for people across the UK. It's also tragic for the families of those involved. But what do the figures really tell us? It's from BBC News. Deaths being reported daily are hospital cases where a person dies with the coronavirus infection in their body. But is the virus causing the death? It could be a major cause, a contributory factor, or simply present when they die of something else. Most people who die with coronavirus have underlying health conditions which can be more of a factor. There are, however, cases, including health workers and a 13-year-old boy from London who died with no known underlying conditions. 500,000 people could have died by August in the UK if no action was taken. Now it's hoped social distancing will limit deaths to 20,000. But that doesn't mean 480,000 lives are being saved. Many people who die from COVID-19 would have died anyway. In the UK, nearly 10% of people aged 80 or over will die in the next year. The risk of them dying if infected from coronavirus is almost exactly the same. That does not mean there will be no deaths, but there will be a substantial overlap. You're 80, it's quite likely you're going to die anyway. So, I mean, should you be too stressed about coronavirus? Maybe we're taking this all too seriously. I mean, I suppose why I think this is a real problem is, one, just because someone has underlying conditions doesn't mean we shouldn't value their life. I mean, this is really new. This is a new entry to political discourse in this country, which I really think takes us back a few steps in terms of compassion and humanity for us to say, well, I mean, you know, they had an underlying condition anyway. Is it really worth us taking a hit of a couple percentage points to GDP to save these people who are sick anyway? I mean, I think that's not particularly healthy way for us to think about the consequences of policy decisions. But at the same time, what they're not saying is that even if you were, you know, even if, and there will be some cases, especially with people who are very old, where the chances of them dying later in the year were quite high anyway. Now, the difference is, if they died, you know, from a natural cause, maybe that they got late stage cancer or whatever, then they would have died in hospital potentially, but their family would have been able to be there, sit with them. They'd have been able to have a funeral where anyone who was, you know, close to them would be able to attend. They'd be able to have a proper send-off. If they die from COVID-19, one, if they've got pre-existing conditions, that means they're less likely to get the ventilator anyway, so they could die, you know, in severe pain, struggling for breath. If they die, or wherever they die, be it hospital or in a care home, their family is not going to be able to visit them, so they're going to die alone. They're going to die alone. They're going to die in pain, and then when their funeral happens, the only people who are going to be able to attend are the closest members of their family because of, you know, infection control. So this isn't just a case of like, oh, they would have died anyway. Does it really matter? What's the difference if they die from COVID-19 or they die from cancer? Well, the difference is it's someone dying alone and in a great degree of pain, or someone dying when they naturally should do with their family around them. I'm going to go to Ash and Aaron in one moment. First of all, I just want to show how ingrained this has become in the BBC's coverage of COVID-19, and it's clearly gone into their style guide about how to report all deaths when it comes to coronavirus. I want to go to a headline, which is how the BBC reported the death of Arima Nazreen. So she was one of the nurses we talked about earlier. She was 36 years old and a mum of 3. So they've written that a nurse dies with COVID-19, right? With COVID-19. So she just happened to have COVID-19. It's like she kind of had it in her pocket. She died of something else. Let's go to a couple more. So this was the day before. Comedian Eddie Large dies with coronavirus. Stacey's mum, songwriter, dies at 52 with coronavirus. Like, who could say whether that caused their death? Who could say? I mean, what I'd say to that is, unless it was the case that Arima Nazreen, a 36-year-old nurse and mother of 2, would have died today in an ICU wing if she hadn't caught coronavirus, and to me that seems pretty fucking unlikely, then you can at least pay her the respect of saying died after catching COVID-19, died after becoming infected of COVID-19, or even died from COVID-19, because I'm pretty sure she wouldn't have died from pneumonia if she didn't catch this disease. And I mean, for one, I'd hazard a guess that when we see nurses falling dead from COVID-19, one of the reasons that has happened is because they weren't provided with adequate PPE, they weren't provided with adequate masks, and they weren't able to take the precautions to keep them alive. So then to say it's just this passive voice, it was accidental, they died with COVID-19, I really don't think that is doing justice to the sacrifice that that brave woman has made.
I mean, you're completely and 100% right. And what's most disingenuous about this is that we already have a model of talking about the role of comorbidities, secondary infections, when it comes to other forms of pandemic illness. And I'm, of course, talking here about AIDS, is that it's very common to talk about AIDS-related illnesses because it's very rare that it's the AIDS virus itself that kills you. It's the effect that AIDS has on your immune system, and secondary infections, for example, like pneumonia, which is most common, would be most commonly the cause of death in cases where AIDS has been unable to be controlled by things like antiretrovirals and so on and so forth. So we already have a model of talking about the way in which there are opportunistic infections and secondary infections and comorbidities which affect the lethality of a particular virus. And so the fact that that same set of language isn't being used here in relation to COVID-19, I think tells you that it is indeed an ideological and a deliberate decision being made. And I also want to talk a little bit about how absurd this matter of the interchangeability of numbers is, because it really is something which falls apart at the faintest interrogation. So let's say that last winter we actually had a fairly mild flu season. So fewer people died of the flu than you would normally expect during the winter season. It wouldn't mean that if I were then subsequently to go up to Michael Walker and stab him in the head, that I wouldn't be done for murder, right? Simply because, well, we will lighten the numbers in this regard. Therefore, one more death, in the government's books won't really make that much of a difference. Therefore, this death doesn't matter, right? That's not how it works.
Can you imagine standing up in court and say, yeah, I stabbed him, but he had diabetes? So is it really that bad?
Arguing. That's essentially what they're arguing, is that the presence of either comorbidities or being older makes your life of lesser value. Now, we don't even have voluntary euthanasia in this country because we do think that there is a principle in the law of the sanctity of life and that there is an overriding imperative to preserve it no matter what the circumstances in cases of old age or illness. We don't even have consensual voluntary euthanasia. So this idea that suddenly, well, death was coming anyway, it was kind of inevitable, therefore the under-equipped hospital won't be seen as a causal factor. The fact that we didn't go on a lockdown when many other European countries and our neighbors were on lockdown, that won't be considered a factor. The fact that there wasn't testing. So I didn't know whether or not my grandmother's carer had COVID-19 and therefore could have passed it on to her when helping her do her shopping or helping her in the bath. No, that won't be considered a factor because numbers are interchangeable. It's completely insane. And what's most disgusting about this is that, in legacy media outlets, they really are constantly just in love with their own sense of mystique, in love with their own status, in love with their own titles. I've never met a group of people who were more addicted to getting high off the smell of their own farts. They really have a hugely inflated sense of self. And one of those things that they talk about is, the grandeur and the calling of journalism to tell stories that need to be told, to tell hard truths and hold the powerful to account. In this case, at the faintest, drop of a hat, they're going around spinning lines which are considered to be too distasteful for the government to utter and say, no, well, actually, these lives of disabled people, people with underlying illnesses and the elderly are worth less. How disgusting is that?
Yeah, there's a few things I want to sort of pick up here. So the first is, imagine if there was a terrorist attack at an elderly nursing home, a care home for the elderly, or for hospice, people who may be in the final months of their lives, and a terrorist attack happened there, hundreds of people died. Would the media go, well, they were going to die anyway? Well, the median age was 80. On average, they were going to last 8 months, 10 months. Of course they wouldn't. Or can you imagine if in Iran or China or Russia, countries that generally speaking, our political class, for better or worse, you might agree, disagree, don't like. Can you imagine if they were reporting in Iran? Well, lots of people are dying in Iran, but most of them are over 80. So that means that actually it's not as many, years as one might think. These aren't really people. I mean, it's obviously nonsensical. And when I look at that video, that excerpt we had from Sky News, first of all, 20,000 deaths was presented as a best case scenario. That's the first thing. They were very clear. If we get 20,000 dead people, by the way, in early February, Public Health England, Matt Hancock, the chief medical officer, all said this was a low risk to Britain. Now apparently 20,000 deaths is a sensational story. We've gotten away with it. Wow, great achievement. 20,000 deaths is not what's going to be expected or predicted or even likely to happen. 20,000 is best case scenario. And then he's dividing the 20,000 saying, well, this, as if it's already happened. Okay, what if it's 100,000? What if it's 200,000? So repeating lines from state agencies, actually misreporting them and then putting them and casting them in such a favourable light for the government. I mean, you run out of metaphors. It's not the kind of thing you would associate with, and I'm being serious, it's not the kind of thing you would associate with the free media. It's just not. It is not. And the thing is, this wasn't the BBC. This was Sky. This is Sky News. So, the government can't turn to them and say, well, if you report this in an unfavourable light, we're going to review the the terms under which you operate, which they can do with the BBC. It's why the BBC is so defanged often in its current affairs and political reporting. I mean, it was unbelievable to watch that.
We should move quite quickly through the other big story of the week, which was testing. So this is a story that has dogged the government all week because for a long time they've been saying we're going to ramp up testing. It became apparent on Wednesday that only 2,000 of 500,000 frontline NHS staff had been tested. I think that's up to about 5,000 now. In the whole country, Britain is managing 10,000 tests a day, which is 7 times lower than what they're managing in Germany, a country with a very similar population, ever so slightly larger. The government's big announcement to get ahead of the news cycle. So I mentioned earlier that even the Tory papers sort of started to ask questions about testing, was to make a big headline-grabbing announcement. Let's go to Matt Hancock's announcement, and this was at his first press conference after coming out of self-isolation yesterday.
I am now setting the goal of 100,000 tests per day by the end of this month. As the Prime Minister said yesterday, mass testing is how we unlock the coronavirus puzzle and defeat it in the end.
First of all, 100,000 tests by the end of the month. There's no suggestion as to how they can do that, but it's another aspiration. They missed their 10,000 target. They've moved their 25,000 target. So they had said that by mid-April, we'll have 25,000 antigen tests a day. Antigen tests are they're the swab that tells you whether or not you have coronavirus. Antibody tests are a blood test. They tell you whether or not you've had it and therefore are immune to it. So the government did promise we were going to have 25,000 antigen tests by the middle of the month, by mid-April. They've now moved that back to the end of April, and then also said we're going to have 100,000 tests. But the problem is, one, they haven't told us how we're going to get there, but two, they're mixing up 2 different kinds of tests. And it seems like they're doing this intentionally because it seems clear they understand they don't have the capacity to do 100,000 antigen tests a day by the end of the month. So they've thrown in this random number of antibody tests, which they think are going to be cheaper and easier for them to roll out. The problem with that confusion, and Matt Hancock, depending on the hour or the day of the week, sort of either suggests, oh, they all will be they'll all be antibody tests. It's all part of my 5 pillars. It changes from minute to minute because I don't think he wants to be honest about this. Why he's thrown in these extra antibody tests is to make themselves look good. And the reason this matters is because if you want the government to get control of the spread of coronavirus, what you need is antigen testing. This is what the Germans are doing. They're doing, 200,000 of these a week. It's going to go up to 500,000 a week. It might already be 500,000 a week, actually. Big numbers. I think it is 500,000 a week. These are the ones where it tests you with a swab to find out if you have it. That allows you to track and trace. It allows you to make sure that no care workers are going into care homes with COVID-19. Obviously, no, I don't want to sound like I'm accusing the care workers. They don't know. They can't get the test. It doesn't tell you. It doesn't allow NHS workers to get tested to work out whether they can go back on the job. So it's these antigen testing it's this antigen tests that matter if what you want to do is contain the disease. The antibody tests matters if you want to get the economy running again so people can go back to work. And yeah, that distinction is often made by Matt Hancock, but he doesn't say what proportion is going to be one and what proportion is going to be the other. Also, throwing them together makes no scientific sense. I just want to get a quote from a Guardian piece today from a biomedical scientist in the NHS. So this is from a Guardian article today. Alan Wilson, the IBMS president, said he did not understand the strategy. Mixing antibody and antigen tests doesn't add up to me, he said. We don't have an antibody test that is any use at this stage. So how can you include that in the 100,000 and not say what the mix within that 100,000 is of antibody and antigen tests? It's just a bit of a muddle still. Wilson, the lead biomedical scientist in cellular pathology at his NHS trust, says they could deliver 100,000 tests for the virus every day, but only if they got the supplies that are currently either available only in tiny quantities or non-existent. What does it tell you that they've announced 100,000 tests without telling us what proportion is going to be antigen and what proportion is going to be antibody, and without telling us how they're going to do it? What that tells us is that we've got a government that's more interested in PR than public health. You know, why did they round it up to 100,000 by throwing in a bunch of random tests that haven't been proven? It was to get a headline. It's because they were like, oh, we're not in control of the news cycle anymore. Let's get a new headline. And they are absolutely, as much as they might want to tell you, being led by the science, in this instance, quite evidently, not being led by the science. Do you think that's fair, Ash, Aaron? When are you going to have a defense of the government testing strategy now? I'm
going to take the controversial pro bullshit position, actually. No, I mean, you're completely right. And don't forget that it was just a week ago where they were talking about millions of antibody tests, which were going to be ready within a matter of days. And it turns out perhaps they're completely useless. But the government already forked out on those 3.5 million tests, so they say. And we were assured that it would be something that could transform the nature of the lockdown and the sort of restrictions on public movement and individual liberty that we're experiencing right now. And so I can't help but feel that this is sort of almost being managed like a reality show. And so they're thinking in terms of what the day's storyline is and how they can end on a high note, a sense of overcoming adversity, the sun's on the horizon, better days are coming, regardless of whether or not that particular plot line is actually going to filter through to the next day or indeed the next week. And again, all of that really confused communication has a huge effect on public behavior. Now, it wouldn't matter if the only thing at stake was their own souls and whether or not they'd, enter the gates of Jannah come the day. It actually has an impact on public behavior, on businesses being able to make plans on whether or not they can reopen, what kind of stability they can offer their workers. There's millions of workers which are still left out of Rishi Sunak's income guarantee packages. It has a huge impact on whether or not people are taking this seriously now and doing things like getting in their car and driving 20 miles, 50 miles, 100 miles to visit elderly relatives to check in and see if they're okay. Has a huge impact on how many times people leave their house, whether or not they're doing it in household groups, whether or not they're going to meet up with people even on the sly. And all of these things have an impact on, one, the economic resilience of this country and what it's going to be like for, in particular, precarious and low-paid workers coming out of the lockdown, and two, the transmission of infections, which are continuing now and to this day, albeit at lower numbers, hopefully, than it was 3 weeks ago.
I mean, I think as long as we have a public conversation which is looking at antibody tests as this game changer, I don't think anybody actually knows what's going on. And as long as the government keeps on presenting antibody tests as a game changer, I will insist they don't have a plan. Because antibody tests are meant to basically, again, I'll go back to what I said earlier on. Nobody knew anything on the face of this planet about how this virus worked until early January, at the earliest. Okay, the first case was in November, December last year. Antibody tests would determine whether or not somebody had had the virus. And so far, the insinuation is that immunity would be an after effect of that. And of course it is. But for how long? Sometimes when you're, if you have chickenpox, you'll have it once. But with other things, you might only have an immune resistance for 3 months, for a season, for a year, for 2 years. So actually, an antibody test doesn't mean that, oh, well, I've had it, I'll never have it again. It means that, yes, you've had it. You might be immune for 3 months or 6 months or for however long. We don't know the virology of this thing yet. But the idea that, oh, you've had it, we can get you back to work, we'll give you an immunity passport, you can get back in the economy, you're never going to have it again. As long as senior politicians are saying this, I will insist they have no plan, because that reveals a fundamental absence of the kind of depth of information needed to actually deal with this properly as a public health crisis. Because it could be the case, we start doing these antibody tests, 20% of the population has had it, they're allowed to go back to work, they can proceed as normal, and they all get reinfected again, and they all give it to other people who are perhaps more vulnerable than them, who never had it in the first place. And you could have an extra 20, 30, 40,000 deaths because people are being sent back to work when they shouldn't be. Again, we go back to the original point here, which is what we were trying to emphasize a month ago. We don't know much about this condition. What we do know is it transmits easily. It's far more deadly than the flu. Surely it makes sense to be risk averse. Surely it makes sense to be cautious. But as long as the media class, as long as Tory politicians, the government, present antibody tests as this game changer, I refuse to believe they have a handle on the situation.
You've mentioned antibody passports there. So I want to link that to our final clip, which is Matt Hancock yesterday sort of floating the idea that we might have immunity passports. Before we go to that, though, I think we've had £100 in super chats. So thank you for that. That is very helpful, very useful for us to continue doing what we're doing. I've actually just had to invest in new Wi-Fi. You'll all be pleased to know. So the connection will be better in the future, because I thought like we're going to be locked down for such a long time. It seems like anyway. And then we'll go to some of your questions. So put them on the hashtag, put them in the comments. This is Matt Hancock yesterday.
We are looking at an immunity certificate, how we can how people who have had the disease, have got the antibodies and therefore have immunity, can show that and so get back as much as normal as much as possible to normal life. That is an important thing that we will be doing and are looking at.
So I mean that's really interesting, and this is why people have talked about antibody tests as a game changer, because whilst it doesn't really limit the spread of coronavirus, I mean it doesn't at all limit the spread of coronavirus, because the only way you can limit the spread of coronavirus is test and trace, different kind of tests. It's the antigen test that find out if you've got it, the antibody test find out if you've had it. So these antibody tests can't contain coronavirus. But what people seem to be imagining is that they can help our lockdown be less economically damaging, because those of us who've had coronavirus and have immunity can get an immunity passport and then go on with our lives as usual. Now, to me, I can see why that's a neat idea. I think there are a couple of big problems with it practically. So on the one hand, I'm just not sure if it's going to be socially sustainable for there to be, those with a special passport that means they can continue their lives as usual, and those who are just expected to stay in their homes. So for one, I think once people start leaving their houses, everyone's going to be kind of inclined to leave their house, unless you've got the cops sort of checking everyone at every bus stop to say, do you have the immunity passport or not? Secondly, if you do end up having this quite invasive process whereby the cops are always checking your immunity passport, there's going to be a massive incentive for young, fit people who aren't particularly concerned about whether or not coronavirus will threaten their life or seriously damage their health, to go and get it. Because obviously, if you've got this immunity passport, you can go to parties, you can go to the pub. If you're self-employed, you can continue to grow your business. You can get out of your house. And so you've created this huge incentive for young people to sort of be on their Facebook. If anyone's got coronavirus, it's like chickenpox parties that kids have when they're all trying to get immunity so they don't get chickenpox when they're older. But chickenpox parties aren't particularly dangerous, because no one dies from chickenpox. If you get chickenpox, there's no chance that you can give a vulnerable person chickenpox and then they die alone, struggling for breath in hospital. If you give people an incentive to get coronavirus, which I think these immunity passports would do, then that to me seems like a big, fat accident waiting to happen.
Can I be quick?
Yeah.
It's not just the young that you would incentivize in terms of having to get it. It's the poor, right? If you're a 55-year-old person, 0 hours contract, and you need some money because you've not worked for several months, you can't make ends meet, you might be a carer. What alternative do you have? And so I think you're absolutely right. Two big questions with regards to any passport. Incentives, they'd be completely screwed up. And enforcement. How the hell do you enforce this? And what kinds of powers would you give the police to start saying to people, may I please see your passport? And if they don't submit one immediately, or if they forgot it, you arrest them. And then you start filling prisons with people. By the way, that's a superb way of spreading a virus. So I just think, again, it's one of these things. You hear it, you go, okay, it sounds like a neat idea. It's a great word to use, Michael. But to me, it shows they've got zero handle on what's going on. They have no plan.
That's so true about the class element of it. And I just think about the 100,000 people in a queue for universal credit, which we know isn't enough to live on anyway. So you have all of these people saying, like, I can't get through to fucking universal credit. So I might as well just get coronavirus so I can, continue on my 0 hours job. Ash, let's get personal. If you didn't have coronavirus, if you were denied an immunity passport and there was some like really, really good event you wanted to go to, would I
go out licking railings?
Would you go out licking railings? Yeah.
I mean, you know what? My own thinking on coronavirus and my own sense of fear about coronavirus has changed a lot in the last month. And I'm just, speaking personally, I think it's been this way for a lot of people I know, which is, I first learned about it. I thought, this is really serious. We're not equipped to deal with it. And I was thinking in terms of our institutional readiness to deal with the virus. And while I was very worried about my stepdad, who recovered from cancer a few years ago and still has various comorbidities and physical vulnerabilities, my sister, whose lungs, I believe the medical term is, they're fucked, and my grandmother, who's obviously very old, is that my concern was always about cocooning and shielding them. But I was very, very blasé about the idea of myself or my partner getting it. Because I was of the view of like, well, it would really suck. And, but I've had bad flus before, we could shake it off. And then I was seeing those stories of, young people in ICUs on ventilators, and they'd had no pre-existing conditions that they were aware of. And it just happened to be the virus hit them really hard for some reason. And there wasn't any tangible reason you could pinpoint for it happening. And so after that, my own sense of how I would feel if I'd got it, or if someone who was very close to me, either of you, for instance, who were young, were fit, were healthy, it was actually radically different. And I went from thinking, well, actually, wouldn't it be better for me to take the hit and know I was immune and I'd be able to do things like see my grandma and make sure she's okay and take things round, is no, I actually feel a lot less relaxed about it, having seen those tragic stories of a 13-year-old who didn't have any underlying health conditions, dying alone and apart from his mom and apart from his siblings, seeing those young moms who work in the NHS and have got young kids of their own dying of the virus. I just think not a risk I'm willing to take. Sorry, I spoke for a long time there, but I was doing a deep dig into every feeling I'd had about this virus.
So it's good. I want you to share your deepest feelings on this show. We're going to go to some questions. 123 Duck, who also gave us a $5 on the super chat, thank you very much, asks, do you guys know of any resources outlet publishing a timeline in government errors, missteps, U-turns, obfuscations in real time? Will Navarra? I don't, actually, and that's a very good point. I think this weekend, if I can't see that existing, I'm going to do sort of like an article or a piece which sort of looks at the deaths happening now on each day and then says what the government was doing 23 days prior. So on the day that most of these people got likely infected, what was the government saying? Because I think that would be a powerful piece which will really, bring to light the catastrophic, which has been like the government's dealing with this up to now. And hopefully, because I don't just want, the government isn't going to fall. What I want is for that to be a stimulus for the government to get better because the media starts scrutinizing them properly. As I say, none of us are here just to throw mud at the government. There are lives at stake.
There is a timeline. I think Al Jazeera published a piece with a timeline.
Oh, great!
A basic timeline. And there's another piece also on declassified, not as detailed. But I'm doing a video sort of like a timeline, which will be up early next week. So
great.
Are there costumes?
There's no costumes. No, it's very low budget.
Jason Bournemouth asks on the hashtag Tysky Sour, does less work and confinement to the home sat in front of TVs for longer mean the public will find it easier to track the contradictions of the 24/7 MSM narratives? Very interesting question.
I'll answer. I mean, well, Ash, you go.
I mean, my instinct is no, not necessarily. I think it will be when people see and experience a huge disconnect between what they're seeing from legacy outlets and what it is they're seeing directly in their communities and perhaps in their own families. That's where the moment of disconnect will come. Because don't forget, we live in a media saturated environment, regardless of how much time you're spending in your house. You have your smartphone, you scroll through BBC News, you get push alerts from particular media outlets. You're engaging with that kind of content all the time. You're having articles forwarded to you on WhatsApp by your auntie. You're seeing things posted on Facebook, seeing things shared on Twitter. So you're engaging with this content an awful lot. And the contradictions and the idiocy is there for all to see all the time. Now, the existence of these 5 o'clock press briefings sort of create a moment at a collective broadcasting experience of the kind that we haven't seen for many years, perhaps outside of, an election cycle where this is the thing, everyone tunes in at the same time to watch it. But so far, they're not showing their teeth. They're not getting follow-up questions. They're not being able to push particularly hard. And then the reception of these press conferences is still very like, oh, very good, sire. Matt Hancock, you did the whole thing without coughing, despite coming out for your self-isolation one day before the CMO advice, and that's still half the time recommended by the World Health Organization. Well, so the tough questions aren't being asked. So it's not necessarily that those contradictions, I think, will become more apparent through a passive viewing experience, but I think it will when there's a collision between the reality presented through the media and that which you're seeing on a day-to-day basis around you.
There's two things to add to that. So the first is the point that you've made in the past, Michael, which is that unlike the 2008 crisis, this is agentive. So it's a horror story playing out in real time in the media constantly. And like Ash says, we're a media saturated age, but people also feel like they have a role, which people didn't think necessarily in 2008 or didn't think they had with Brexit, which, let's be real, was nowhere near as momentous as 2008 or this, obviously. I was in a shop the other day and I heard a young woman say, I have to leave to go and do a presentation, presumably over Skype or whatever. She was a student. And one of her colleagues jokingly said, you don't have to, you're a key worker. And they both chuckled. But it's also a fact. And there's an ideological realization there that what was 2 months ago, low pay, precarious bullshit work, is now really fundamentally important to the reproduction of society. And that's a kind of agency that, isn't normal. That's a really big break. And so I agree with Ash. There's going to be moments of disconnection between those profound realizations that aren't normal and how this is presented by the media. Like if we try in 6 months' time to go back to business as usual, oh yeah, by the way, these are all shit jobs. They don't really matter. They're all unskilled. By the way, a marketing director should be on 20 times more than you are. I think that would be quite hard to return to. A bigger point is the collapse of the print media. The print media have not really played a role in this crisis. The broadcast media has been everything. Often people say, oh, Aaron, but you're attacking legacy media. More people are watching broadcast than ever before. That's absolutely true. When I would complain about the coverage of the Labour Party, it was always BBC or radio or to a lesser extent Sky, but basically BBC. And that's what defines people's understandings of these things. And it could be the case in 3 to 6 months, if we're talking about the media, there may be several papers of national stature which aren't here anymore. They will be gone. One is probably the Evening Standard, but there are others too. And so this may be a really radical, transformative period, both in how people engage with the media, the kinds of media they're, reading in a new way, like Novara Media, or watching or listening to, but also what kinds of media production is all of a sudden just not really as influential as it was. And I think in real time, we're seeing actually the hegemony of social media and broadcast really asserted against print media. Now, can print media come back? I don't think it can. This has been a long story. It's been a decade more in the making. But, it could be that this is the death knell for print media.
I'm going to ask one more question, and I want you to answer it super quick for a specific reason, which is that it's going to be the theme of our special show tomorrow, I think morning, probably around 11 a.m., which will be a live stream of us reacting to the Labour leadership results. Obviously, those results come out, I think, tomorrow at 10:45. So actually, we might even go live at 10:30. In any case, make sure you have your eyes on our YouTube for instant reactions to who has won the Labour leadership election. I mean, to be honest, it's not going to be particularly surprising who wins. Probably we'll be talking, a lot about what the percentages say about the political position and confidence that anyone should enter that role. I mean, it's going to be Keir
Oh my
Starmer
God,
and
is it
Angela
going to be
Rayner.
Mike Gapes?
It's going to be embarrassing if I'm wrong now. Mike Gapes, sort of like a last-minute new entry. So many people wrote in his name that he has been crowned Labour leader. But in any case, you're going to both get about 30 seconds to answer this question and then, save the longer answer for tomorrow. Does the coronavirus crisis and the economic fallout and response force Keir Starmer to lead from the left? What does his leadership look like politically over the course of the crisis? This is from Marv A.
So Keir Starmer, I don't think, is a movement leftist in the same way that Jeremy Corbyn or John McDonnell is. I would say he's a technocratic progressive. So it means that it's actually going to be, I think, fairly easy to keep him on the left when it comes to economic issues, in particular, because if he doesn't stick to the left and, stick to the principles of the 2017 and 2019 manifestos, he will be outflanked from the left by Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson. So that's the easy part. The difficult part will be shaping and reforging what the role of the movement is post-Corbyn and how Keir Starmer is going to relate to that. Now, I think that actually the coronavirus pandemic shows the necessity of having that left-wing movement that can organise in communities and shape demands directly stemming from the material precarity of the class of workers, a diverse working class that Labour represents, is made of, and needs the votes of in order to win the next election. And that should be the role of the movement.
Will he go to the left? Well, he'll certainly have to raise more taxes as a potential prime minister if he became the prime minister, probably than any prime minister in history. We're going to be running 10% plus deficits for a couple of years. Debt to GDP gets to 100% or more. We've had a stagnant economy for the best part of 10 years, stagnant productivity, wages, falling home ownership, all of these long-term problems now bolted onto a crisis bigger than 1929. So whether or not his supporters like it, he's going to have to certainly argue for a bigger state, greater rates of taxation. The point is, will that be conjoined to a project which puts working people first, which empowers the labour movement, which democratises the economy? There's two Keir Starmers. There's one who does that and who, in a sense, builds on the Corbyn years. And there's another who basically is the left wing of the status quo and manages permanent austerity in a slightly more progressive way. Either of those, I think, in historic context, would be viewed as far more left wing than anything we've seen since before the 1970s. Obviously, I would prefer the former.
We are going to wrap it up there this evening. Thank you so much, Aaron and Ash, for joining me tonight. Fox, our producer, has confirmed that we will be going live tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. To discuss those results, how the leadership election has played out, what that says about the various campaigns, and what it says about the future direction of the Labour Party. Thanks again, Ash.
Thank you, Michael. Can I just say that you've been incredibly impressive during this time? I feel that you've been precise, you've been clear, you've been ferocious and unrelenting, holding the government to account. And Aaron, the work you've been doing I've been learning from it. I've been learning from you both. And this has really helped me stay sane and somewhat sanguine during a really difficult time. And I love you guys.
Well, that means the world, Ash. The super talented Ash thinks what I do is valuable. In any case, that's it for us this evening.
Michael, you forgot one thing.
What? Smash the like button.
You haven't smashed the like button.
Oh, yeah. If you haven't smashed the like button, smash the like button. I can't see the YouTube. How many people have liked it, Aaron? Can you see?
We've got 1,100 watching, 678 likes. Come on. If you're watching, smash the like button.
Get it to 1,000. You've been watching Navarro Media. You've been watching Tysky Sour. Good night.
Bye.
Bye.